Welcome to Shop Talks. Topic today is dye migration, a scary, scary topic. Right, gentlemen? So first I want to thank my sponsors. We got Alpha Broder, Los Angeles Apparel, Hirsch, Lane 7, NASDAR, and Omniprint, and most of all, Impressions, who put on this show, and Impressions Magazine. And then I'm from In Kitchen. And with me, I have Mark Bailey, who is head of decorator relations with Sanmar, longtime person pushing for actually caring that the garments they sell can be printed. Amazing. Rob Coleman, who leads the sales group at NASDAR, longtime guy, knows a lot about ink. And
cheers.
Bruce Basin, who's from Saudi, also longtime industry guy, knows a lot about ink. So we're going to talk about dye migration, how to test for it, how to avoid it, and what happens on the garment end as well. So who wants to actually explain what dye migration is first? Rob, how about you?
Oh, wow. How much time do we have?
What is it? What goes on?
Okay, we'll try and...
What does it look like as a layperson, and what technically is going on, in the background?
Perfect. We'll try and do the 40-second version. So dye migration is basically the polyester dyes that will migrate through an ink film. So we think white ink, red shirt, and over time, that white ink turns pinkish. Okay. There's also a dye sublimation, which basically looks the exact same, but it's where those dyes will gas if they cured at too high of a temperature over the sublimation point. Either way, the ink film turns color.
Fun, huh? And does this happen right away so you can stop it right away?
Yeah, that would be nice. The answer is it depends. You can see, most time you see it immediately, it is dye sublimation, but dye migration is kind of like the hidden killer. It's like cholesterol, really. It can happen days or a week after the time. So, and that's the real issue.
We actually, I remember printing some sweatshirts that I had on a shelf, and I had just thrown it, went into a run. It didn't fully migrate for about a year. It was a little gray. Actually, it looked white when we did it, and then a little gray, and then it was almost all black by the end. So on the garment end, so how do you avoid it, and what kind of dyes can you use, and what can the customer look for that knows that it's not going to be such a problem?
Well, I think fabric-wise, you want to look for anything that's a cationic fabric. Dye process. We call it posi-charge. That's our trademark name for it. But in those cases, those garments are dyed with a dye that withstands a much higher threshold of heat. But heat is still the enemy, and time. So it could be from it starts to trigger because your flash was too hot, too close, too long. Then it goes in the dryer, and then a lot of times production-wise, time is money, and so it goes immediately packed into a box, and it just radiates through the garments and continues that dye process. So a lot of decorators will ship something that was inspected and looked fantastic, and 2 days later it gets to their customer, and there's a problem.
That is the worst feeling in the world. Or 2 weeks even, right? It can take a long time.
Yeah.
So Bruce, to combat it, you just print the ink really thick, right? So if it's a red garment that's going to bleed, you just put the white ink on real thick, right?
Well, it's still going to bleed through there. Might take a little longer.
Actually, that is worse, right? To do that.
Yeah, because then it's hours and days later instead of where you can see it right away.
Not to mention, at that point, you have to heat it more to cure that ink. So you think you're solving it, and actually you're making it worse.
Well, of course, you always need to cure the ink through and through. One of the things that has helped over the years has been more and more of the low temp inks that are out there. People are able to cure if their dryer can be a consistent temperature at the lower temp, whether it's 270, 280 versus 325. The other thing that's been helpful over the past few years is a lot of the blocker inks, the gray blockers to put down where basically the charcoal in the ink helps block the migrating pigment coming through.
Can I add one thing? That Bruce brings up a great
Please do.
point, and low cure is absolutely, low cure inks have been around for some time, but now it's more critical than ever. But there's a lot of misinformation out there, and I see it out on social media. People just say, oh, use a low cure ink and you don't have to worry about dye migration. And that's absolutely not true. The low cure absolutely helps you cure it, and it helps with the sublimation because you're going to stay below the sublimation points. But if you do not have a robust bleed resistant ink, it will absolutely still dye migrate, which is why Bruce brought up the blockers, right? The dye blockers. So, there are two phenomena. So low cure is great, but you still need a low cure bleed resistant ink to stop the post dye migration.
I always like to give people like some tools to decipher all the information that's out there. When I hear I just use, no, there is no ink.
There's no one size
No,
fits
there was
all
no
in
ink. That that's wishful thinking. I mean, back in the day,
Magic in a can?
back in the day, in some ways, you could use a cotton ink or a low bleed. Some people would use a low bleed all the time, and they were fine. Covered 50/50s. Those days are long gone, my friend, right?
Since the leaded ink went away, that helped.
You're dating yourself now, Bruce.
Yeah, well.
All right. So, what do you do with that? So the worst bleeding thing that people often talk about is like digital camo. What's the heavy artillery of ink that you can use in such situations?
Change your customer to something else.
A black bleed blocker for sure.
A black bleed blocker.
Yeah.
For sure.
So that's just like gray on steroids, more or less.
Pretty much.
So some people, that's counterintuitive. They might be new to the industry. What do you do? I mean, so you're printing black to get white? How does that work,
Well, you're
Rob?
basically printing
Or-
an underbase of a black bleed blocker. And then you're obviously flashing and then putting your colors on top, probably your white and then your other colors to actually help. Also, a low bleed white would help on top of that. Now, going back to one thing we talked about was the low temp inks. If all your inks are not low temp, then you can't cure them at low temp. You got to be aware of that. If you got some older inks on your shelf that aren't low temp, don't do that. I know that's not part of this whole thing, but
No,
just
that's all
be
right.
aware of that.
So in other words, actually, even if you use a low temperature white that's made for polyester and you put other colors on, you're going to have to heat it up, so that might not work, yeah?
That's correct.
So,
The other avenue, that most decorators don't educate their customers on is finding a better fabric, right? That is a cationic. It's going to cost more, but in the end, it's going to cost less because of the different setups and the runs, right? And then the hand feel becomes much different when you have to put those heavy bleed blockers on it. So, we always try to encourage people to go to a better product, right? Because everything in the marketplace is there for a reason. And a lot of polyester is around price points. And you get what you pay for, The lower the price point, typically it doesn't go through a clearing process to strip the excess dye off the fabric, which typically gases off before the actual dye inside the fabric, So there's a lot of things that go on, but it builds the price point, right? But in the end, it's a better solution just to find a cationic fabric.
so I saw somebody say, if it's going to have dye problems, put it through the dryer real hot ahead of time. How's that work?
Not good. I mean, it might help a little bit, but it's still going to happen down the road.
Actually,
Now,
in the
I
old
was-
days, wasn't that true that sometimes the dyes weren't set, but that doesn't seem to be an
Yes,
issue
you know,
anymore.
Rob and I were just laughing. There is a solution that's been pretty good, and I'm going to let Rob talk about that because he's more of an expert than I am.
I won't use the word expert, but I hang around some smart people, so I get a bit of osmosis, get some understanding. So we're primarily been talking about ink systems, mostly plastisols, right? There are some other solutions with different ink chemistries, and silicone ink is one of those. Specifically when we're talking about polyesters, because do understand when we're talking about dye migration for polyesters, a root cause of that for a plastisol is the plasticizer. That's an oil, and it basically solvates the dye. It acts as a conduit. So with a silicone, there is no plasticizer, okay? There is no, basically a silicone either dries or it doesn't. There's no gel point, there's no curing of it. And it's very, very low cure. We could be talking in the 230, 240 degree range, with the catalyst. Now, is it a end all to beat all for all your printing? No. It works great on smooth polyesters. It doesn't work so good on hairy fabrics. There's no matte down property. So if we look at, anything, let's call it like maybe even a Nike Legend fabric that has a bit of soft fuzz to it. But it's a more expensive in the bucket product, but it's absolutely should and could be part of your arsenal of how to combat certain things and dye migration or dye sublimation.
It's not really the product for the $3 crappy polyester shirt. It is for the $250 jacket that's going to bleed. Yes?
Touche. Good point. I can tell you that there was, we were talking about some of the digital camos. There's a large manufacturer of, these type of fabrics, and they used to run all plastisols, and quite frankly, they ran every brand. I mean, all the brands over time they ran, and they allocated, it was up to about 20% of their overall sales for what they're gonna have to buy back for their customers for migration and sublimation. They started using silicone and pretty much dropped that to, a nominal 1-2%.
So a lot of times now, I know, for example, Sanmar and some of the other companies do give some better information for their products. But when you don't know what you're dealing with, you want to describe what a dye migration test is like to try to get an idea of what's going to happen before you go printing?
Yeah, I can cover that. It's pretty simple. As a matter of fact, you might even be able to go onto the Ink Kitchen's website and
I actually
and
have
see
the
this.
test there.
Yes,
Yeah.
but it basically with a piece of what you may think suspect fabric, let's just call it a red fabric that we think may have dye migration. I'm going to just set that on a transfer press. I'm going to get a white cotton, 100% cotton piece, put it right on top. Drop a couple drops of plasticizer, which is basically a reducer.
So yeah, when you're buying that would be it would be a non-curable reducer.
Great
right?
point. Yes.
Because curable reducer has resin and plasticizer. Non-curable reducer has no resin.
100%
It's
correct.
just
It's not a
plasticizer.
plastisol thinner, it's a reducer. So if you got something that says plastisol thinner, that's not it.
So make sure your heat press is heated up.
Yeah,
I've seen people do that, because they weren't using it that day and they just go and make the test. So at what temperature?
We're probably setting about 320 or so, and
Yeah.
just dropping it on there. In other words, I'm going to white fabric on top of red, drop it to a plasticizer, clamshell down, 320 degrees, maybe 30, 35 seconds, and pop it up. And look at the white fabric, and what are we looking for?
So what you look for, ideally you would have no color, but that doesn't happen that often. You actually have to get used to doing these tests. And so you'll get, if you see just a little bit of pink or, it's probably okay, doesn't need much. If you see, the white is the color of the fabric you had it on, you better run for the bucket of black dye blocking ink. So it kind of gives you an idea, and over time you get an idea from that test what you're dealing with. Sometimes you can even do it in an obscure place on the garment and not even ruin the garment. But if you're doing thousands of garments, you're crazy really not to, if you're not familiar with that garment.
And it is a bit subjective because you're taking a visual, and really, as Rick said, it's over time. You kind of get a feel for it. When I'm may be able to just use a standard bleed-resistant white, or maybe a super, robust, super type of poly white, or to go to a full, like a carbon black, type of product.
Now, I know you have a pretty consistent manufacturing. You don't usually use different facilities that much. But I would say sometimes to look for it are when you see maybe a new country of origin for
Correct.
a garment, or and then you also can't even just trust the garment if you know it. I remember we tested some raincoats, not for your company, but 9 of the colors hardly needed anything, and one bled like crazy. And the dye migration test told us what we were dealing with.
Yeah, there's helpful hints too. At least on our website, we have decoration spec sheets now for every style and what kind of decoration that product supports, and then tips or things to be mindful of. in the decoration process that should trigger your production teams to go, wait a minute, let's rethink this before we run it.
It's actually, it's really funny, but I mean, Rob's on Facebook a lot, and Bruce, and you'll see someone go, why did this happen? And then sometimes I'll just go to your site and say, needs a, low bleed ink. And then or they'll say, I use this ink and it works for everything. And then, you go to the Wilflex or Rutland thing and says, do not use on polyester fabrics. It's like you have to do your research. And, hearsay or the I just use blah, blah, blah and everything is a really bad approach.
You brought up the point about country of origin, and that's absolutely a fact. I mean, a quick little story. Back in the days when I worked for an ink manufacturer, I was traveling, happened to be at a customer site. They had, let's just call it 144 pieces that they printed, the exact same ink, all printed at the same time, and 12 of them had severe dye migration. All the others were okay. Asked all the normal questions, same bucket of ink, same dryer, same press. Got to looking at them, and by chance, they were all, let's call them double XLs, and all of those bled. They were all from one country, and none of the others did. So to Rick's point, even though they're the same brand, they came out of different countries, different dye houses, and they reacted differently.
Right, there's different ways to dye something and have it come out the same way.
One of the things you'll also see is some colors will migrate more than others, as you know. Reds are bad, greens are bad. I
Purple.
found those purples are bad.
Purple and burgundy.
So, be aware of that.
The
You're
wine
running,
colors.
You're running a blue and you're not having issues, doesn't mean you're not going to have it with the red. So you need to check all your different colors.
And actually, when you do that dye migration test, it does matter what color it is. Like if you see it maybe a slight migration, but it's blue, when they say white looks whiter than white, it's because it has blue in it. So you really don't have to worry as much. Like it's bluing agent, right? And so people's eyes see blue and white as just whiter sometimes. It's really not a big problem. Whereas pink is a disaster usually. Gray isn't always seen so much, but you start looking at something turning pink, it's not a good idea. And actually another hack is to just print pink from the start. If it gets pinker, that's not a problem. A lot of things are solved with customer service or art, not necessarily technically.
If you can explain that to the customer ahead of time and lead them in the right direction, that's going to be helpful to you.
Yeah, I love the customers. I bet some of you have had the same thing, where you're like, this fabric needs, a gray blocking ink, so it's going to be 3 screens, not 2. Yeah, well, I don't want to do that. It's like, oh yeah, you do. Like, no choice.
But you do, in many cases, I am a big believer, and you do get what you pay for in many cases. Not always, but I can tell you, because you mentioned earlier on the cationic dyes, and a lot of people may not know what that is, but we did some testing with those in the early days, and I was amazed at how less of a robust white ink we needed, because they did not migrate compared to other dye processes.
Yeah, it is super complicated, hence you need the test. I mean, we've tested for garment manufacturers and have tested, 50/50s that a cotton white works on. Doesn't need anything. And then tested, that even a poly white won't work on the 50/50. Then you have to use a blocking. So you really do need to test or be familiar with your brand.
For sure. Rick, can we just jump back to the conversation that you were talking about, where some decorators will try to gas off any excess that's on top of the fabric by putting it down the dryer?
Yeah.
And I would just recommend that you don't do that, because what happens more often than not, you shrink the product significantly, because now it's going down that dryer twice, and you can change the specs of the garment. That's usually where a lot of people fail. So you got to be really careful on that.
All right. You have anything you're dying to say? Otherwise, I think we'll do questions.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
I would just say it doesn't only apply to screen printing. Anything heat applied, this can happen. So especially with transfers, you want to make sure that you have a charcoal backing on your transfers as well. And then just ask experts. You know, they're in kitchen. You know, you can communicate with them too. I mean, there's lots of resources before you go down and decorate a product you're unfamiliar with. You know, just ask.
You know, that's a
One
great
thing you
point
need to
because
be
there's. Oh, sorry, Bruce.
One thing you need to be aware of is flashing. If you're flashing at an extremely high temperature more than you need, that's going to have an effect also.
And the last thing I was going to say, Rick, is, you know, the good thing about the internet and social media there and just, you know, the Google box is there's tons of information that's available. Unfortunately,
The bad thing is there's tons of information.
bingo, you're exactly right. So, you know, I love the peer-to-peer discussions, but anybody can be an expert. And there's a lot of bad information out there. So I would recommend, you know, don't believe everything you read and hear, and, you know, talk to your suppliers, talk to other, you know, industry people, and get their advice as well, because there is bad information.
I will repeat that I just use whatever. Rule those people out. That's always a bad idea. One other thing, actually, I will put in that we didn't mention. Transfers are a great new solution. So, you know, everybody's talking about DTF. I don't know. I've seen a lot of it in the last month, and it really is a great solution. You can make them with your DTG machines. You can buy machines for them. You can buy them. Stalls has a great product. Supercolor has a great product. And I mean, we were making them with our DTG machine, and then they were applied at 245 for 12 seconds. No dye migration at 245, none. So it's a great solution when you're afraid. All right, let's open it up to questions. Who has a question? Maybe we have an answer. So the question is, or comment is, we just use 100% cotton all the time, so we don't have to worry about dye migration. True? False?
True, but then you have to worry about other things.
The only aspect, I would say true 99.9% of the time, but
You
I
get
haven't
more than
seen
me. I
it-
was going to say 90.
Okay. I haven't seen this in a while, but I can tell you back in the day, and Rick probably lived some of this, there was, say, huge shortage of black cotton shirts, and there were surpluses of other colors. So what happened? Some of the mills re-dyed those shirts. Okay, took a blue shirt and re-dyed it black, and next thing you know, you had some issues of migration. It's a different phenomenon because it's not polyester, but it still is the dye set that was coming through.
You see it on black especially, because they'll take like a burgundy that didn't work and turn it into black. And then the other place you can see it, I'm really not a chemist, so I don't know, but on particularly pigment dyed shirts, you can get, they turn pink. It can be from stacking, and it can be from other things, but some of it is actually dye migration. I know, because I used to, before, I don't know now, but Comfort Colors, when they were privately owned, I used to do the testing for them, and they had trouble, even as big as they were, in having consistent dye stuffs, and certain dyes they use would have a dye migration problem. So then those were all cotton. So sorry, no
Yeah.
solution there either.
So that is a place for blocker, and the plastel printers, of course, that does make a thicker ink film. There are water-based blockers though that work extremely well. So you can, a lot of people take those Comfort Colors and will use the water-based systems, and it absolutely helps with the drapability in the hand compared to a 100% solids like a PVC-based plastisol.
And if, again, not all of them, but a lot of them discharge. So a discharge would be a solution on a Comfort Colors or any kind of pigment or dye,
Yeah, that's the
garment
key
dyed
word.
shirt.
Yeah, pigment dyed, garment dyed. Those are the key words to look for.
Yeah. Other questions?
We as a
So the question is, just in Samar's case anyway, how often is there overdyed, and is there a way to segregate the garments, I guess, right? Or to know that might happen?
As a company policy, we do not overdye anything for any reason. We can't say the same for mills that we represent, but our own private labels, we do not overdye.
That's great to know. It's a good
Yeah.
piece of information.
All right, other questions? Anything else now that we've been sitting here that you thought of about dye migration?
Well, again, if something we talked about earlier, which helps but it's not a cure-all, is as you start buying inks more and more, go to the low temp inks and try and weed out your, use up your other inks. That will help a good amount.
Anything else?
No, I just agree with that. Purchase the right ink for the right fabric. A lot of decorators choose to want to just use what they stock and their process. That's their form of risk management, but at some point in time, that will come back and bite you.
I think the only other thing that we didn't cover is monitor your dryer temperature. A lot of times I see people have a problem. I always use this ink and now it's not working. And, you really have to test your dryer. So, a lot of times, again, online, you'll see someone like, what do I set my dryer on? It's like, I don't know. Are you in like 100-degree dry heat in Arizona, or is it like 45 in Maine, and a moose is looking in the window and it's the garment's full of moisture. And so you have to really do testing, and there's all kinds of testing materials. You really need to use them all. Test strips that you send down,
Probes.
the probe, which is like the donut probe. I don't know the real name for it, but a little donut you send down. That can also see if you have hot spots in your dryer. And then the dryer, the gun, or the pyrometer is the official name, where you test it as it comes out. And you really, to find out what's going on, need all of that. The temperature on your dryer is not the temperature. It is a relative thing of wherever that probe is, that's where the temperature is. It's not necessarily what's going on in the chamber. It's not necessarily what's going on at the bottom of your ink film. So there's no real substitute for doing a lot of testing. Everybody wants to not do that, but you have to.
And if I can add to that, it's been my life for a lot of years. And, you look at a technical data sheet, and on a water-based product, it says, I need let's just pick a number. I need 300 degrees for 30 minutes. So you know what? I know if I've got a gas dryer, I could set that ambient temperature for that time, and I'm going to be okay. Plastisol is a little different. You know what they say? Let's just take a standard pure Plastisol, 320 degrees. It will generally say something like 320 degrees throughout the ink film. What does that mean? And to the point we're talking about before, do I have an ink film this thick or an ink film this thick? I need to get throughout that, or it's like cooking a steak. Do I want it well done or medium rare? In this case, you want your ink well done. And lastly, to your point about the temperatures, if you're running infrared dryers, it may be a panel temperature of 900 degrees to pick a number in order to get, for that duration of time, your ink film to that magic number.
Another question. Okay, so the question is, when you use the donut probe, the Atkins, which most of us have, are you putting it on the ink, the garment, or the belt? Yes.
Yes.
All of the above.
Absolutely. Really, you do want the ink temperature, and that's what matters. But I can also tell you, depending on your shop, if you've got, let's say you've got a big dryer, a 60-inch wide belt, and say it's a 15-year-old dryer, and maybe you're not cleaning it out as much, it's very interesting if you just run that probe on the belt, probe side up, to look at your ambient temperature and mark it, left side belt, center, right side. I have seen 90-degree variances at the exact same point on a belt. So how are you going to cure properly all over? So to Rick's point, and whatever, all of the above.
All right. Any
Yeah.
other questions?
I
or
would
we
just
good?
say one last comment on this whole thing with dryers is there's a lot of decorators that think they can run a dryer a lot hotter but faster and get good results. And that's just not how it is. It's like a steak. You sear it at a high temp, but the middle is all pink, right? It's the same thing with ink. You really have to have that constant curing.
Yeah. Longer and lower is better if you can. So that it's a little like baking a cake as well. You try to bake a cake for 10 minutes at 500 degrees. It doesn't work too good. All right. So, any other questions, or are we good? All right, we're going to be around. Rob said his NASDAR booth. Where's your booth, Bruce? Over that way. Mark's at SAMR, and we're around. We're all approachable. One reason we do this is that you see who's the experts, and you can catch them later with your very specific questions, or if you're shy. So again, I want to thank sponsors, Impressions in Kitchen, where I'm from, which is a free source of information online. Los Angeles Apparel, Hirsch, Alpha Broder, NASDAR, Lane 7, On Print. Thanks a lot. Thank you all for coming. We got a full schedule over there. It's all free. And thanks for coming.
Thanks everybody. Cheers.
Take care.